I never believed in angels until the night I found one bleeding in my barn, dressed not in robes of white, but in something that shimmered like starlight woven into fabric, his eyes reflecting a tarot made about what lies beyond our world. The military had cordoned off our entire county that evening, their helicopters cutting through the darkness with searchlights that swept across my fields, like the fingers of some mechanical god searching for something they desperately needed to contain. I'd locked my doors and drawn my curtains like everyone else, listening to the thunder of boots on gravel roads and the crackling voices on radios speaking in codes I couldn't understand, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't name. But something pulled me toward the barn, not a sound exactly, more like a trembling in my chest, a frequency I felt rather than heard that made my hands shake as I pulled on my coat and stepped into the cold March wind. When I pushed open that heavy wooden door, the smell of hay and old timber mingling with something else, something like ozone after lightning strikes, I saw him huddled behind the tractor, his body curled into itself like a child hiding from monsters. His face turned toward me and I froze, because his eyes were not quite right, too large, too luminous, holding depths of color that seemed to shift between amber and violet, and something I have no name for. He raised one trembling hand, not in threat but in supplication, and I saw the wound along his side, a strange silvered blood seeping through his torn garment, and in that moment every rational thought fled my mind. What remained was something deeper than logic, deeper than fear, recognition that bloomed in my soul like a flower opening to impossible light, telling me that, whatever he was, whoever he was, he needed help, and I was standing at a crossroads that would define not just my life, but my very understanding of God's creation. The searchlight swept past my barn windows and his whole body tensed, that otherworldly glow in his eyes intensifying with pure animal terror that transcended species and spoke to something universal in all created beings. I didn't decide to help him, not consciously. My body simply moved, grabbing horse blankets to cover his shimmering form, positioning myself between him and the door, my mouth forming words I barely recognized as my own. "Stay quiet," I whispered, and he nodded with an understanding that needed no translation, his breathing shallow and rapid as heavy boots approached outside, their rhythm matching the frantic beating of my heart. The barn door shuddered under someone's fist and I stepped outside, pulling it closed behind me, facing three soldiers whose faces were hard with purpose, and whose weapons were raised with the casual readiness of men hunting something they'd been trained to fear. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual, their eyes scanning past me toward the barn, and I heard myself lie with a conviction that surprised me, telling them I'd been in my house all evening, that I'd seen nothing, heard nothing. My voice steady despite the war raging inside my conscience. Something in my tone must have satisfied them because they moved on, their boots crunching away into the darkness, their radio chatter fading into the distance like a receding storm, leaving me alone with the enormity of what I'd just done. I waited until silence reclaimed the night before slipping back into the barn, finding him still hidden beneath the blankets, his eyes now watching me with something beyond gratitude, something like wonder, as if my small act of compassion had revealed to him a truth he'd been searching for. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying an accent that belonged to no earthly nation, the words shaped carefully as if he'd learned our language from transmissions sent across impossible distances. I knelt beside him, my hands shaking as I pulled back the blanket to examine his wound, and he placed his hand gently over mine, his touch warm and solid and undeniably real, erasing any possibility that this was dream or delusion. "I mean no harm," he said, those luminous eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt like being seen, for the first time in my life, truly seen, down to the hidden corners of my soul where I kept my doubts and hopes and secret prayers. In that moment, kneeling on the hay-strewn floor of my grandmother's barn with a being from beyond earth, I felt the presence of something sacred settling over us like a benediction, as if the very air had become thin enough for heaven to shine through. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why were they hunting him? But my heart, that deeper instrument of knowing, simply rested in the strange peace that had descended despite the impossibility of everything unfolding around me. He seemed to sense my turmoil because he slowly sat up, wincing at the pain in his side, and gestured toward the workbench where my grandfather's old tools still hung in perfect order. "May I?" he asked, and I nodded, watching as he moved with careful grace to retrieve something from a pocket that seemed to exist in folds of his garment I couldn't quite perceive with my normal vision. What he produced was small, no larger than a river stone, but it pulsed with an inner light that cast no shadows, and when he held it toward me I felt that same pull, that same inexplicable certainty that had drawn me to the barn in the first place. "Before you ask your questions," he said softly, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones, "I must tell you something that will sound impossible, something that will challenge everything you were taught about humanity's place in God's creation." His words hung in the air between us like a prayer waiting to be answered, and I found myself leaning forward, my breath caught in my throat, sensing that I stood on the threshold of a truth that would shatter my world and rebuild it in dimensions I had never imagined possible. Outside, the helicopters continued their search, their mechanical thunder a reminder that we existed into realities. Simultaneously, the mundane world of military operations and lockdown counties, and this other realm of wonder that had opened like a door in the fabric of everything I thought I knew. He looked toward the sound with something like sadness crossing his features, those impossible eyes dimming slightly as if remembering losses too great to name. "I am not from another star," he said finally, turning back to me with an expression of such vulnerability that my heart ached in response. "I am from Mars, from the world you see as dead and barren, but which has held life as old as your own species, civilizations that have watched humanity grow from your first fires to your first satellites, waiting, always waiting, for you to become ready." The words should have sounded like madness, should have sent me running for help or questioning my sanity, but instead they settled into my soul with the weight of truth, the kind of truth that rearranges everything in its wake. I thought of Scripture, of the verses that spoke of God's many mansions, of a creation so vast and varied that human minds could barely comprehend its scope, and I wondered if perhaps we had been reading those words too narrowly, limiting divine creativity to our small corner of existence. His hand still held that glowing stone, and as I watched, its light began to intensify, casting the interior of the barn in colors that had no names, and I understood that I was about to be shown something that would change not just my life, but my very understanding of what it meant to be human in a cosmos far more populated and purposeful than I had ever dared to imagine. The stone in his hand began to pulse with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat, and I realized with a start that it was responding to me, to my presence, as if it recognized something in my very being that transcended the boundaries between our worlds. He held it closer, and suddenly the air between us shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement, but cold and alive with purpose, and images began to form in that shimmering space, not projected on any surface, but hanging, suspended in 3 dimensions, so real I could have reached out and touched them. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs and brought tears to my eyes without warning, because there before me stretched cities of impossible beauty carved into Martian caverns, their towers reaching upward toward stone ceilings that glowed with cultivated light, their streets filled with beings who moved with grace and purpose through gardens that bloomed in colors Earth has never known. The architecture spoke of millennia of refinement, of a civilization that had learned to live in harmony with their world rather than dominance over it, their buildings flowing like organic sculptures that merged technology and nature into something that could only be described as art made manifest. I watched people for they were people, however different their forms, gathering in what looked like town squares, their faces animated with conversation, children playing in fountains that defied gravity, elders teaching beneath trees that grew in underground soil enriched by countless generations. My mind struggled to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I'd been taught about Mars, that dead red desert we'd sent robots to photograph and analyze, finding only rocks and dust and the ghosts of ancient rivers long since dried to nothing. "How," I whispered, my voice breaking on that single word, and he turned those luminous eyes to me with such gentleness that I felt seen and known in ways that both terrified and comforted me. "We learned long ago to live beneath the surface," he explained, his accent wrapping around our language like silk around stone, making even the impossible sound reasonable and true. "When our atmosphere thinned and our surface became hostile to life, we did not abandon our world, we went deeper, building cities in the vast cave systems, tapping the warmth of our planet's core, learning to thrive in darkness by creating our own light." His words carried the weight of history, of collective memory spanning timeframes my human mind could barely comprehend, and I thought of the Israelites wandering in the desert, of Jesus retreating to caves and wilderness places to pray, of how God had always met his people in unexpected locations, teaching us that the sacred could manifest anywhere, in any circumstance, if we had eyes to see and hearts to receive. The scene before me shifted, the Martian cities fading like mist to be replaced by something even more staggering: massive structures, floating in the clouds of Venus, their surfaces gleaming with mother-of-pearl iridescence, whole communities suspended in that toxic atmosphere we'd always assumed could harbor nothing but chemical death. Then came the moons of Jupiter, and I saw installations carved into ice, domed cities on rocky satellites, observation posts that had watched our Earth for longer than human civilization had kept records, all of it hidden from our telescopes and probes through technologies I couldn't begin to understand. Why hide from us? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of wonder and something that felt uncomfortably like grief, because I suddenly understood how alone we'd made ourselves, how isolated in our ignorance and our assumption that we were the pinnacle of God's creative achievement. He dimmed the images with a gesture that seemed almost reluctant, as if showing me these wonders had brought him joy that now had to be set aside for harder truths. And when he spoke, his voice carried a sorrow that transcended the personal and touched something cosmic in its scope. "We don't hide from you," he said gently, his hand reaching out to touch my shoulder with a warmth that felt brotherly, familiar in ways that defied the alienness of his origin. "We wait for you. There is a difference, a crucial difference that your prophets and mystics have always understood, even when your scientists could not." He paused, watching my face as if measuring whether I could bear the weight of what came next, and I found myself nodding, giving him permission to shatter whatever remained of my old understanding. "Your world is quarantined, not by our choice but by necessity, because humanity has not yet learned to master the violence that lives in your hearts, the division that separates you from one another and from the divine unity that binds all creation." The words struck me like a physical blow because I knew their truth immediately. I thought of our endless wars, our hatred between nations and races and religions, the way we'd weaponized everything from atoms to information, turning God's gifts into instruments of destruction and control. "But there is hope," he continued, his voice rising slightly with an emotion that sounded like desperate faith, and I saw tears forming in those alien eyes, crystalline drops that caught the strange light and made him seem more human than any person I'd ever known. "That is why I came, why I risked this mission despite the danger, to walk among you, to assess whether the seeds of compassion we've observed from our distant watching posts have taken deep enough root to overcome the thorns of your fear and aggression." His hand tightened on my shoulder and he looked at me with an intensity that burned away every pretense, every social mask I'd ever worn, leaving only the raw truth of who I was beneath all my failures and small successes. "When you chose to help me tonight, when you risked your safety to shelter a stranger who by all logic should terrify you, you showed me the answer I came seeking. You demonstrated the love that your Jesus taught, the same divine love that flows through all God's children across all his worlds." In that moment, I understood that my small act of compassion had been a test one hadn't known I was taking, and that its implications reached far beyond my own salvation or damnation, touching instead on humanity's collective readiness to join a cosmic family that had been waiting for us since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. Outside, the helicopters swept closer, their searchlights probing the darkness with renewed urgency, and I knew our time was running short. But I also knew that I had been given a glimpse of divine truth that would sustain me through whatever came next, a revelation that heaven was not a distant abstraction, but a living reality woven throughout the very solar system we called home, the revelation that he came not from distant stars but from Mars, our neighbor. The red world we'd photographed and studied and dismissed as lifeless hit me with a force that nearly buckled my knees, because the implications were staggering in ways that transcended mere astronomy or biology. I had imagined, in the few moments since finding him, that if he were truly alien he must have traveled light years across impossible distances, but to learn that an entire civilization had flourished just tens of millions of miles away, hidden beneath the surface of a planet our rovers had crawled across like blind children, shook something fundamental in my understanding of reality itself. He watched my face as comprehension dawned, and I saw in his expression a mixture of sympathy and something that looked like relief, as though he'd carried this truth like a burden and sharing it lifted some weight from his soul. "We have watched you since the beginning," he said softly, settling onto a hay bale with a weariness that spoke of more than physical exhaustion, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest. When your ancestors first looked up from the African plains and wondered at the red star in the night sky, we were already ancient, already observing, already praying that you would survive long enough to join us. The word praying struck me like lightning because it implied something I hadn't dared consider, that these beings knew God, that they worshipped the same Creator who had formed the dust of earth into Adam and breathed divine life into human nostrils. My hands trembled as I pulled up an old crate to sit facing him, suddenly desperate to understand how faith and cosmos intertwined in ways my Sunday school teachers had never imagined, how the divine could be both universal and intimate, both local to earth and spanning worlds beyond our own. You know God? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid somehow that speaking too loudly might shatter this moment like fragile glass, might wake me from what surely had to be a dream despite its overwhelming reality. He smiled then, and it transformed his face from merely beautiful to something that radiated a joy so pure it hurt to witness. The way looking directly at the sun hurts even as you're drawn to its brilliance. We know the Creator, yes, the one who spoke all things into being, whose love is the foundation of every atom, every star, every living soul across all the worlds he has made, he answered, and his words carried a certainty that came not from blind faith, but from experiential knowledge, the kind of knowing that transforms belief into unshakable truth. Your Jesus taught that God's house has many rooms, many dwelling places. Your theologians assumed he spoke only of heaven. But what if he meant something larger, something that encompasses all the worlds circling all the suns? The question hung in the air between us, revolutionary and yet somehow perfectly aligned with everything Christ had taught about the boundless nature of divine love. I thought of the parable of the Good Shepherd who leaves 99 sheep to find the one that's lost, and suddenly understood humanity's position in a new light. We were not God's only children, but perhaps his most troubled ones, the prodigal species that had wandered far from the path while our siblings watched and waited for our return. Are we the youngest? I asked, piecing together fragments of understanding into a mosaic that revealed a picture both humbling and hopeful, both terrifying and strangely comforting in its implications. He nodded slowly, his luminous eyes reflecting depths of compassion that seemed almost parental, the way an older brother might look at a sibling still struggling to learn lessons he had mastered long ago. The youngest, the most impulsive, the most brilliant, and most destructive all at once. You carry such potential for greatness, alongside such capacity for harm, he said, leaning forward with an urgency that made every word feel weighted with cosmic significance. Your scientists marvel at how quickly you've advanced from primitive tools to space travel in mere thousands of years, but they don't realize that this rapid growth is precisely what makes you dangerous. You've developed the power to destroy worlds before developing the wisdom to preserve them. His words echoed warnings I'd heard in church about pride coming before the fall, about the tree of knowledge bringing both enlightenment and responsibility, about how gifts from God required maturity to wield properly. The sound of boots on gravel outside pulled us both to attention, soldiers sweeping closer in their methodical search, and I realized that Earth's authorities feared exactly what he represented: not invasion or conquest but revelation, the shattering truth that we were neither alone nor as advanced as we'd imagined, that our quarantine was self-imposed through our own failure to embody the love that Christ had demonstrated in every action of his earthly ministry. They hunt you because they're afraid, I said, understanding flooding through me like water breaking through a dam, washing away confusion and leaving clarity in its wake. He nodded gravely, rising to his feet with fluid grace despite his earlier wounds, his body already showing signs of healing that defied human biology. They fear what I represent, proof that humanity must change, must evolve not technologically but spiritually, must learn to see all beings as brothers and sisters in God's infinite family, he explained, and I heard in his voice an echo of prophets who had been persecuted for speaking uncomfortable truths throughout human history. But you chose compassion over fear when you opened your door to me, and that choice is the seed from which humanity's future will grow. The same mustard seed Jesus spoke of that seems small but contains within it the potential for transformation that reaches to the heavens themselves. He reached into a fold of his garment that seemed to shimmer between fabric and something more ethereal, withdrawing a device no larger than my palm that pulsed with a soft amber light, its surface covered in patterns that shifted like living geometry. Whenever I tried to focus on them directly, "Let me show you what your governments have hidden, what your telescopes were designed not to see," he said, his voice carrying both sadness and hope as he activated the object with a gesture that seemed more like a caress than a mechanical command, and suddenly the air between us bloomed into three-dimensional images so vivid and detailed that I gasped and nearly fell backward off my crate. Before my disbelieving eyes materialized a view of Mars that shattered every photograph I'd ever seen, not the barren red wasteland of NASA images, but a world alive with purpose. Vast crystalline domes rising from beneath rust-colored sands like cathedrals of light, their surfaces refracting the distant sun into rainbows that danced across structures built with mathematics that seemed to sing. I saw gardens growing in caverns carved from ancient lava tubes, trees with silver leaves reaching toward artificial suns, water flowing through channels that followed patterns too perfect to be natural, too beautiful to be merely functional, and beings moving among it all, hundreds, thousands of them, his people, living lives of grace and intention in a civilization that had mastered the art of dwelling within, rather than consuming without. We retreated underground when our surface became inhospitable eons ago, learned to work with our world rather than against it, and in that humility found a deeper relationship with the Creator who asks all his children to be stewards, not conquerors, he explained, his words washing over me as I stared transfixed at this impossible reality. The image shifted, without transition, flowing like water into a new scene that stole my breath. Completely Europa, Jupiter's ice moon that I'd only ever seen as a frozen sphere in textbook photographs, now revealed as a realm of wonder beneath its crystalline shell, where vast oceans teemed with life and cities of impossible beauty clung to the underside of miles-thick ice like barnacles of light. I saw beings there too, different from my companion, more aquatic in their grace, their forms adapted to pressure and depth in ways that spoke of God's infinite creativity, his endless delight in crafting life to flourish in every possible environment, even those humans had dismissed as eternally dead. Spires rose from the ocean floor toward the ice ceiling above, bioluminescent and organic, grown rather than built, their architecture a collaboration between intelligent design and living systems that had learned to work in perfect harmony over countless generations. They are our neighbors, our brothers and sisters in creation, worshippers of the same divine source who painted Europa's icy surface with those red-brown streaks. Your scientists analyze without understanding. They're seeing the chemical signatures of agriculture, conducted on a scale that spans a moon, he said, and I heard in his voice such profound affection for these distant relatives that it brought tears to my eyes, because I suddenly understood what it meant to truly love thy neighbor across not just miles but worlds, schools of creatures, whales perhaps, or beings like whales but conscious and deliberate in ways that transcended animal instinct, moved in formations that looked like worship, like prayer made visible through synchronized motion, and I knew without being told that they sang praises to their Creator in frequencies that human ears had never been designed to hear. Venus appeared next in the projection, but not the hellish furnace of sulfuric acid clouds and crushing atmospheric pressure that every scientist had described with such certainty. Instead, I saw layers of civilization floating in the high atmosphere where conditions were surprisingly temperate, cities built on platforms that rode the jet streams like ships sailing an ocean of air. The beings there moved through filtered sunlight that gave their environment a perpetual golden glow, their architecture all flowing curves and organic shapes that captured moisture and synthesized it into the very fabric of their dwelling places. Technology and biology merged so seamlessly that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. They mastered the art of dancing with adversity rather than fleeing from it, built paradise in a place that seemed designed to destroy life, and in doing so learned lessons about divine grace that we, who had easier paths, sometimes forget, my companion explained, his voice thick with admiration that transcended any pride or competition between worlds, speaking instead to a communion of species who celebrated each other's victories as shared triumphs of God's vision. I watched their young ones learning in gardens suspended miles above the scorching surface, saw gatherings that could only be worship services, where light itself seemed to bend in response to their devotion, and understood that faith was not an earth-bound phenomenon, but a universal response to the Creator's presence, as natural to conscious beings as breathing, as inevitable as gravity. The crystal clarity of these images carried with it an emotional resonance that bypassed my skepticism entirely, communicating truth not through argument, but through direct experience, the way Christ had taught through parables that conveyed meaning beyond mere words. When the projection finally faded and the barn returned to its humble reality of hay and shadows and distant helicopter sounds, I sat in stunned silence with tears streaming down my face. Not from sorrow, but from overwhelming joy mixed with grief, joy that creation was so much vaster and more wonderful than I'd imagined. Grief that humanity had isolated itself from this cosmic family through our own violence and spiritual immaturity. Why hide all this from us? I finally managed to ask, though even as the words left my mouth I knew the answer. Could feel it in the way my own government pursued this peaceful visitor with weapons and fear, rather than welcome and curiosity. Could see it in every news broadcast filled with division and hatred between humans who shared the same planet, the same air, the same divine origin. He placed the device back in his garment and looked at me with eyes that held both infinite patience and urgent hope. The expression of a teacher who knows his student stands at the threshold of understanding, but must choose to cross it themselves. It's not hidden. Beloved child of earth, your own sacred texts speak of signs in the heavens, of God's glory declared by the skies, of a creation that groans waiting for humanity to mature into its true purpose, he said gently, and I recognized the references to Romans, to Psalms, to the cosmic scope of redemption that theologians had somehow reduced to a merely human-centered drama when Scripture itself pointed to something infinitely larger. My mind reeled with the implications of what I had just witnessed, struggling to reconcile the images still burned into my retinas with everything I had been taught about our place in the universe, about humanity's supposed isolation in a vast and empty cosmos that suddenly felt crowded with divine intention and purposeful life. I found myself pacing the barn's dusty floor, my hands trembling as I ran them through my hair, the weight of revelation pressing down on my shoulders like a physical burden that threatened to crush my old understanding of reality into powder. But we've sent probes, rovers, orbiters, we've mapped Mars and studied Jupiter's moons and analyzed Venus's atmosphere. I protested, hearing the desperation in my own voice, the fear that comes not from discovering something dangerous, but from realizing that your entire worldview has been built on foundations of sand, carefully constructed illusions that served someone's purpose, but not truth itself. He watched me with compassion that somehow intensified my internal struggle rather than easing it, the way a loving parent watches a child work through a difficult lesson that will ultimately set them free but requires the pain of growth first. Technology can be designed to see or to overlook, and your governments chose the latter decades ago when contact was first made, when the decision was taken by a few to keep the many in darkness because unity among worlds might demand unity among nations. He explained with sadness that seemed to age him before my eyes. My thoughts flew to classified programs, to whistleblowers dismissed as crazy, to the overwhelming resources poured into military dominance, rather than peaceful exploration, and suddenly 1,000 conspiracy theories I dismissed gained terrifying plausibility, not as paranoid fantasies, but as fragments of suppressed truth. I stopped pacing and faced him directly, this being from another world, who somehow felt more human in his honesty than most people I'd known in my entire life, and asked the question that burned hotter than all the others. Combined the question that terrified me precisely, because I already knew its answer would change everything. Why now? I whispered, my voice breaking with emotion I couldn't contain, tears flowing freely down my cheeks as I stood there in my own barn feeling more vulnerable and exposed than I'd ever felt in any church or confessional, because this wasn't about ritual or religion, but about raw confrontation with cosmic reality. Why risk your life to come here, to tell me this, to show me what governments and militaries want hidden? I gestured toward the barn walls beyond which soldiers prowled with weapons designed to kill what they feared and feared what they couldn't control. The machinery of human violence grinding ever closer to this moment of impossible grace. He rose from where he'd been sitting, and despite his injuries and exhaustion, there was a dignity to his movement that reminded me of Christ washing the disciples' feet, authority expressed through humility, power channeled into service rather than domination, strength that protected rather than destroyed, because waiting has its season and action has its hour, and the cosmos itself is shifting toward a moment of decision, where humanity will either mature into its divine calling or collapse under the weight of its own refusal to love, he said, and I heard in those words an urgency that transcended his personal mission, a sense of spiritual warfare not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers that St. Paul had named, the forces that sought to keep humanity small and divided and afraid. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture that seemed universal, a sign of sincerity that needed no cultural translation, and continued with intensity that made the air between us feel charged with holy purpose. Your generation stands at the threshold. You have technology powerful enough to destroy your world or heal it, communication that can unite or divide, knowledge that can humble or inflate, and the choice you make collectively in these coming years will determine not just Earth's fate, but whether the quarantine continues or ends, he explained. And I understood then that this wasn't about alien invasion or human inadequacy, but about spiritual graduation, about a species learning to embody the love their creator had always intended. The word quarantine hit me like a physical blow, and I actually staggered backward against a wooden post, its rough surface grounding me as my mind spun through the implications of what he'd just revealed. That Earth wasn't ignored by the cosmos, but intentionally isolated, not abandoned by God, but held in a kind of cosmic hospital ward until we recovered from the infection of violence and hatred that made us dangerous to ourselves and others. You mean we're being protected from, or they're being protected from us? I asked, though I knew the answer even as the question formed. Could see it in every news broadcast about war and terrorism, every political speech dripping with demonization of the other, every comment section on social media where humans treated fellow humans with casual cruelty that would have horrified previous generations, who at least pretended civility mattered. Both, he answered with a sorrow so profound it seemed to emanate from his very cells, and I realized I was witnessing not just an alien being but a soul capable of grief, someone who mourned humanity's condition not with judgment but with the broken-hearted compassion of God weeping over Jerusalem. Your species possesses beauty and creativity that astounds the solar system, your music, your art, your capacity for self-sacrifice and heroism, but you also harbor a darkness that you've refused to fully confront, a willingness to divide your own kind into categories of worthy and unworthy, to wage war over resources you could share, to hoard wealth while others starve, to destroy the very planet that sustains you for short-term profit, he said. And each word landed like a stone on my conscience because I knew he wasn't speaking abstractions, but naming sins I'd participated in through action or complicity or simple indifference. I thought of the locked doors I'd walked past without helping the homeless, the political rhetoric I'd consumed that made me fear people who looked different, the comfortable numbness I'd cultivated to avoid feeling the weight of global suffering, and shame washed over me not as condemnation but as recognition, the way light doesn't attack darkness but simply reveals what was always there. The quarantine isn't punishment, he continued, his glowing eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt like being seen by God himself, stripped of all pretense and performance, known completely and somehow still loved. It's mercy keeping you contained until you're ready to interact with civilizations that resolved these conflicts millennia ago, preventing you from carrying war and exploitation beyond your world, until you learn the divine lessons your prophets and teachers have been trying to show you since the beginning. The mention of prophets sent electricity through my nervous system because suddenly this wasn't just about politics or sociology but about Jesus, about Buddha, about every messenger who'd ever spoken truth about love conquering hate and unity transcending division. And I understood with stunning clarity that what I'd always thought of as merely religious teaching was actually cosmic law, spiritual physics as real and fundamental as gravity or light. You're saying that what Jesus taught, love your enemies, forgive 70 times 7, the last shall be first, that wasn't just moral advice but the actual requirement for joining the larger community of worlds? I asked, my voice rising with a mixture of wonder and something like vindication, because I'd spent years watching Christianity reduced to political tribalism and consumer religion while its revolutionary core of radical love got buried under institutional weight. He nodded slowly, and his smile crossed his face that transformed his alien features into something that reminded me of the icons I'd seen in Orthodox churches, that quality of otherworldly peace that Renaissance painters tried to capture when depicting saints who'd glimpsed heaven. Every inhabited world eventually reaches this threshold, where technological power outpaces spiritual maturity, and the species either destroys itself or undergoes transformation, what you might call repentance or metanoia, a fundamental change of mind and heart that makes them safe to know and be known by others, he explained. And I heard in his words an echo of Paul writing that creation itself groans in labor pains, waiting for the revelation of God's children. Christ's message wasn't unique to Earth, but a specific expression of universal truth tailored to your context, delivered at a crucial moment in your development, and the fact that even now, 2,000 years later, many still resist its simple command to love reveals how deep your quarantine must go. I felt tears streaming down my face again, but these were different than before, not tears of fear or confusion, but of recognition. The way the prodigal son must have wept when he finally understood his father's love had never wavered despite his wandering. My legs suddenly felt weak and I sank down onto a hay bale, no longer able to stand under the weight of revelation that was reorganizing everything I thought I knew about faith, science, humanity, and our place in God's vast creation that was apparently far more populated and intentional than I'd ever imagined. So the UFO sightings, the abduction stories, the government cover-ups, that's all connected to this quarantine, to observers checking on us, to authorities trying to maintain control over information that would force us to confront our own immaturity, I asked, piecing together fragments that had always seemed disparate, but now formed a coherent picture of cosmic containment managed both by outside civilizations and inside conspirators who preferred darkness to the disruptive light of truth. He moved closer and knelt beside me in a posture of equality rather than superiority, and I was struck by how this gesture mirrored Christ's humility, the God who knelt to wash feet and stooped to write in dust, power that descended rather than dominated. Your governments made contact decades ago and were offered a choice: gradually prepare humanity for full disclosure and the spiritual growth required to end isolation, or maintain secrecy to preserve existing power structures that depend on fear, division, and scarcity. He revealed, and anger flared in my chest at the betrayal, at leaders who'd chosen control over liberation, who'd kept humanity locked in ignorance to serve their own interests. Some in your militaries worship technology and power more than the Creator, and they hunt me not because I'm dangerous, but because I represent what they've suppressed: evidence that humanity's destiny is communion, not domination, that we're meant to be a family of worlds united under divine love, rather than an empire built on force. Outside, I heard vehicles drawing closer, voices shouting coordinates, the machinery of that very domination system closing in on this barn where truth had been spoken, and grace had been offered to someone the powerful deemed insignificant. He reached out and took my hand, his touch warm despite everything I'd assumed about alien beings and cold-blooded creatures. And in that simple gesture of connection I felt the answer to every sermon I'd sat through, wondering if God was real, if love actually mattered, if the universe had meaning, or was just random particles colliding in indifferent void. This is why I came to you specifically. Why, among all the farms and all the places I could have sought refuge, I was guided to your barn, he said. And I heard capital G guidance in his words, the suggestion of providence that religious people claim but rarely experience so tangibly, because you're one of millions who are ready, who've kept their hearts soft despite the hardness of your world, who still choose compassion when cruelty would be easier, who still believe love matters even when cynicism seems more sophisticated. He continued, and I wanted to protest that he had the wrong person, that I was no saint, that I'd failed more times than I'd succeeded at being decent. Your civilization doesn't need perfect people to end the quarantine. It needs people willing to choose differently, to let the virus of fear and hatred die in them rather than spreading it further, to embody the love that Christ demonstrated so that others remember it's possible, he said, squeezing my hand as helicopter rotors began to thump in the distance. Time running out for this impossible conversation that had already lasted beyond all reasonable hope. I realized then that I was being commissioned, that this wasn't just about witnessing something extraordinary but about becoming something different, allowing this encounter to transform me from spectator to participant in humanity's cosmic story. And the weight of that responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely right, like finding a puzzle piece that explained the shape of my entire life. You see hope in me, I whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat, hammering in my chest like drums announcing either execution or coronation. And I genuinely could not understand how this being from another world could look at me ordinary, flawed, afraid, and see anything worth hoping for when I'd spent most of my life feeling inadequate even by my own standards. His eyes brightened with that otherworldly luminescence that no longer frightened me, but instead reminded me of how Scripture described Moses, descending from the mountain with his face shining from proximity to the divine, a radiance that wasn't generated from within, but reflected from having stood in the presence of Something infinitely greater. I see someone who opened their door when they could have closed it, who chose protection over self-preservation, who listened when they could have called for armed men to eliminate what they didn't understand, he said, and tears began streaming down his face in a way that shattered every assumption I'd carried about aliens being emotionally cold or merely analytical observers of human drama. These weren't tears of pity or disappointment, but something far more powerful, the tears of someone who'd searched desperately for evidence that a patient God's long investment in humanity hadn't been wasted, that the seeds planted by prophets and mystics and that carpenter from Nazareth had actually taken root in soil everyone else deemed too rocky and shallow. You don't know how many farms I passed, how many people I observed through windows who would have turned me over immediately, who've become so hardened by fear that compassion feels dangerous to them, a weakness that their world punishes rather than rewards. He continued, his voice breaking with emotion that made him seem less alien and more like a weary missionary finally finding one responsive heart. After years of rejection, I thought about the version of myself that might have existed if I'd made different choices. Over the years, if I'd let bitterness calcify around my disappointments, if I'd allowed the constant bombardment of news about humanity's cruelty to convince me that caring was foolish and cynicism was wisdom, and I recognized how close I'd come to becoming one of those people behind closed curtains he'd passed by in his desperate search for refuge. I almost didn't come out here tonight, I admitted, the confession spilling out because his vulnerability had created a space where my own truth could exist without shame, where I didn't have to pretend to be braver or better than I actually was. I heard something in the barn, and my first instinct was to call the authorities, to let someone else deal with whatever problem had invaded my carefully controlled little world. And it was only because I remembered a sermon about entertaining angels unaware that I grabbed a flashlight instead of a phone, I said, realizing even as I spoke that this encounter was the answer to prayers I'd been praying without words for years, prayers for meaning, for proof that the universe bent towards something more than entropy and accident. He nodded with recognition that told me he understood the spiritual warfare of that moment, the battle between the person fear wanted me to be and the person love was calling me to become, a battle that happens in 1,000 small choices that seem insignificant until suddenly you're face to face with a being from Mars and you realize your entire cosmic destiny hung on whether you chose flashlight or phone. That's exactly what the Creator works with, not perfection but willingness, not certainty, but the courage to move toward love even when everything in your survival instinct screams to move toward safety, he said. And I heard in his words an echo of every parable where God chose the unlikely, the overlooked, the ones who simply said yes when everyone more qualified said no. The helicopters were close enough now that I could see searchlights cutting through the darkness beyond my barn walls, geometric shafts of illumination that would soon pin us like specimens under laboratory examination, and the contrast between their harsh artificial light and the gentle glow emanating from my visitor felt like a visual representation of the choice facing humanity, the light that seeks to expose and control versus the light that reveals and liberates. What you call hope, I call evidence, he said with sudden urgency as footsteps crunched on gravel outside and voices barked orders in the clipped language of men trained to neutralize threats rather than understand mysteries. Evidence that Christ's resurrection wasn't just about one man defeating death, but about planting resurrection possibility into human consciousness, creating a template for transformation that allows individuals to die to fear and rise into love, which is the only evolution that matters to the civilizations waiting to welcome you home, he explained, and the word home landed in my chest with the force of prophecy, because I'd always felt like an exile even on my own planet, always sensed that humanity was meant for something more than the violence and division we'd normalized. Every person who chooses compassion over cruelty, forgiveness over vengeance, generosity over hoarding, is casting a vote for Earth's liberation from quarantine, is demonstrating that the divine DNA Christ revealed is finally expressing itself in human behavior rather than just human aspiration, he said, standing now and moving toward the barn door with the resigned grace of someone who'd known from the beginning that this meeting had a time limit. I wanted to grab him and beg him to stay, to keep explaining, to give me more answers to questions that were only beginning to form. But I understood that this wasn't about getting all the information, but about receiving the one truth that mattered, that love isn't just a nice idea, but the fundamental force holding the solar system together. the gravity of grace that draws all things back to their creator. Tell them, he said, turning to face me one last time, as the barn door began to shake from fists pounding on the other side, his glowing eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt like commissioning and benediction. Simultaneously, like being ordained for a ministry I'd never applied for, but had somehow been preparing for my entire life. Tell them that the watching civilizations aren't waiting for humanity to build better weapons or faster ships, but to build better humans. That the technology to join the cosmic family already exists, but will never be shared with a species that would weaponize it. That the only key to ending isolation is the one Christ already provided, when he commanded his followers to love even their enemies, he said, his voice layered with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical form, as if he was channeling a message from the collective hope of worlds I'd never seen. Tell them that every act of kindness weakens the quarantine, that every choice to see the divine image in another person rather than a threat or competitor is a vote for reunion, that God's patience is infinite, but God's desire is for all the children to finally come home to the table that's been set since before your son ignited, he continued, and I was nodding through tears because I understood that I was receiving what ancient prophets would have called a word from the Lord, a commission to speak truth that would be dismissed by some and treasured by others. That would cost me comfort, but give me purpose. The door burst open behind him and he smiled at me with such peace that I knew whatever happened next was part of a plan larger than either of us could comprehend, a plan where even military containment served the ultimate purpose of love, teaching itself to creatures who'd forgotten they were made in the image of the God who is love itself. The soldiers burst through the barn door with rifles raised and flashlight beams cutting through the dusty air like swords meant to divide truth from mystery, and I instinctively stepped between them and my visitor, even though I knew my fragile human body would provide no real protection against the weapons they carried or the orders they'd been programmed to follow without question. But in that moment, something happened that stopped them mid-advance. My visitor raised his hand not in surrender, but in a gesture of peace so profound that even these trained warriors hesitated, as if some ancient memory buried deep in their genetic code recognized the posture of benediction rather than threat. Before you take me, let me give her what I came to deliver, he said with a calm authority that seemed to reorganize the very atoms of tension in the barn. And to my shock, the lead soldier lowered his weapon slightly and nodded, perhaps responding to orders coming through his earpiece, or perhaps responding to something deeper that even military conditioning couldn't completely erase. My visitor reached into the folds of his garment and withdrew an object that caught the harsh lead light and transformed it into something that looked like concentrated starlight given physical form, a crystal approximately the size of a human heart that pulsed with interior luminescence, suggesting it was less a thing and more a living testimony. This contains everything, he said, placing it in my trembling hands with the care of someone passing an infant to its mother. And the moment my skin made contact with its surface, I felt a warmth that wasn't quite heat and a vibration that wasn't quite sound, but something that resonated with the frequency I'd always imagined prayers might travel on when they left human lips and journeyed toward divine ears. Images of our cities, our history, our observations of Earth's development, testimonies from other worlds about their own encounters with the Creator's love, evidence that will seem impossible until your scientists examine it and discover materials that don't exist in Earth's periodic table, geometric mathematics that couldn't have been fabricated by human imagination, he explained rapidly as the soldiers began to close in again, their brief moment of reverence giving way to the mission parameters that defined their reality. The weight of what he'd given me was far heavier than its physical mass, and I understood I was holding something that governments would kill to possess or suppress, something that could either unite humanity in wonder or divide us further, depending on whether fear or love shaped our response to its revelations. Why me? I asked one final time, needing to understand why an ordinary person with no credentials or platform had been chosen to carry evidence that belonged in the hands of scientists or world leaders, or at least someone who understood how to navigate the systems of power that would inevitably want to control this information. His glowing eyes met mine with an expression that contained both sadness and hope, the look of someone who'd seen enough of human institutions to know they often crucified truth tellers rather than celebrated them, that official channels were frequently the places where divine revelation went to be bureaucratized into meaninglessness or weaponized into control, because the meek really do inherit the earth, just as Christ promised. And throughout history God has chosen the foolish things to confound the wise, the weak things to shame the strong, the overlooked and underestimated to carry the messages that crack open paradigms, and let new possibilities flood in like light into tombs, where humanity has been hiding from its own resurrection, he said. And I heard in his words the entire arc of biblical history, where shepherds received angelic announcements and teenage girls carried divine promises, and fishermen became the architects of movements that outlasted empires. The powerful will debate and committee this into oblivion, but you'll simply tell your story, and stories have a way of slipping past the defenses that facts and arguments can never penetrate, entering hearts through the side door of imagination and empathy, the same way Christ's parables smuggled revolutionary truth past the guards of conventional thinking. He continued as gloved hands grabbed his arms and began pulling him backward toward the door. I clutched the crystal to my chest, feeling its pulse synchronize with my own heartbeat as if it was establishing a connection that would sustain me through whatever challenges lay ahead, as if he'd given me not just evidence, but a companion for the journey, a physical reminder that the universe was far more magnificent and purposeful than the reductionist narratives that had flattened mystery into mechanism and wonder into mere chemical reaction. The last thing he said before they dragged him into the night was not a warning or instruction, but a promise that landed in my spirit like a seed containing forests. You're not alone. You've never been alone, and every time you doubt, hold that crystal and remember that the God who scattered life across the solar system like a gardener scattering seeds is the same God who knows every hair on your head and every fear in your heart. And that same God is desperately proud of you right now. The barn fell silent after they'd gone, except for the sound of helicopter rotors beating the air into submission as they lifted off with their captive. And I stood there in the sudden emptiness, holding a crystal that contained proof of everything, while simultaneously realizing that proof was never really what humanity lacked, but rather the courage to believe that we're loved enough to be part of something greater than our violence and fear. I looked down at the object in my hands and saw my own face reflected in its facets, multiplied and refracted into dozens of versions that reminded me of what he'd said about humanity being on the verge of transformation, about how we contained multitudes of possible futures and every compassionate choice was a vote for which version would emerge into manifestation. The crystal grew warmer as I held it, and images began to flicker in its depths. Without any technology, I could identify brief glimpses of towering structures beneath red Martian soil, beings that looked almost human tending gardens and biodomes, children of another world, learning in schools where the curriculum apparently included both quantum physics and contemplative prayer. And suddenly I understood that the separation between science and spirituality was an artificial wound that only Earth had inflicted on itself. I thought about everything my visitor had said about Christ planting resurrection possibility into human consciousness, about love being the fundamental force of cosmic civilization, about the watching worlds waiting for us to mature into the family we'd always been meant to join. And I realized that the crystal in my hands was less about proving their existence and more about igniting possibility in human imagination, about giving us a vision of who we could become if we chose the path of love over the path of fear. I walked out of the barn into the pre-dawn darkness that was just beginning to surrender to the first hints of light on the eastern horizon, and the symbolism wasn't lost on me that I was emerging from this encounter at the exact moment when night yields to day, when what was hidden begins to be revealed, when the world transitions from the realm of dreams into the realm of action and consequence. The crystal pulsed against my chest where I'd tucked it inside my jacket, its rhythm steady and reassuring like a second heartbeat, or perhaps like the heartbeat I should have had all along, the rhythm of connection to something infinitely larger than my individual existence, yet intimately concerned with every detail of my particular journey. I knew that everything was about to change, that I was carrying information that would make me a target for some and a prophet for others, that I would be called crazy and blessed sometimes in the same breath. But none of that mattered, because I'd been given the one thing that every human soul craves, beneath all the noise and distraction: confirmation that we matter, that we're part of a story written by a loving author, that our choices echo across worlds we've never seen, and that the invitation to transformation isn't just metaphor, but the most practical and urgent reality in a universe where love is literally the technology that unlocks our cosmic inheritance. As the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in colors that no human language had adequate words to describe, I held the crystal up to catch the light and watched it transform those rays into a spectrum that included shades I'd never seen before, colors that perhaps human eyes weren't yet developed enough to process. And I understood that this was exactly what my visitor had been trying to tell me, that we're perpetually on the threshold of perceiving more, becoming more, loving more. If only we have the courage to believe that the God who created galaxies is the same God who whispers in our moments of compassion that we're finally becoming the beings we were designed to be, all along, before the soldiers had come, when it was just the two of us in the barn, with time collapsing into that eternal present, where truth reveals itself without the interference of past prejudices or future anxieties. My visitor had shared something that felt like the culmination of everything he'd come to say, the core message that all his other revelations had been carefully preparing me to receive without my mind shattering under the weight of paradigm-shifting truth. He'd placed both of his hands on my shoulders with a gentleness that reminded me of how I imagined Christ might have touched those he healed, and his luminous eyes had searched mine as if measuring whether my heart had expanded enough to hold what he was about to reveal, whether the soil of my understanding had been tilled sufficiently for the seed to take root, rather than bounce off hardened ground. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible until you realize it's the only thing that ever made complete sense, he began, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire barn with resonance. The creator you call God, the one whose nature Christ came to reveal, did not make Earth as an isolated experiment or humanity as a lonely species wandering a dead cosmos, but rather designed this entire solar system as a deliberate family, each world bearing life, suited to its conditions, all of us grown from the same divine intention. Like children in a household who look different but share the same parent, the words landed in my consciousness like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples outward that disturbed every assumption I'd built about humanity's uniqueness, our special relationship with God, our central position in the drama of creation and redemption. But what about Christ? I asked, my voice breaking because suddenly I feared that everything I'd believed about Jesus, about salvation, about God's specific love for humanity was about to be revealed as provincial narcissism, that my visitor was about to tell me we were just one minor civilization among many, and that our sacred story was cosmically insignificant. His expression transformed into something so tender and understanding that I felt he'd anticipated this exact fear because he'd probably seen it in the faces of others, across centuries of careful contact with selected humans. This terror that expanding our vision of God's creation might somehow diminish rather than magnify the miracle of divine love made flesh in a particular time and place. Christ's incarnation on earth was not less significant because other worlds exist, but infinitely more significant because of what it revealed about the Creator's nature, he said with an intensity that made every word feel capitalized and underlined. Think about it, God could have chosen to reveal divine love through spectacular displays of power, through cosmic exhibitions that forced belief through overwhelming evidence, but instead chose the way of vulnerability, of being born helpless, of suffering and dying to demonstrate that love willing to descend into the depths of another's experience is the force that holds entire solar systems in orbit round the truth. He gestured upward as if pointing through the barn roof to the planets spinning in their ancient pots, and I suddenly saw them not as random spheres of matter, but as a family held together by the same gravitational love that had pulled Christ downward into human flesh, the same attractive force that made God incapable of remaining distant from creation's pain. Every world in our solar family knows this story now, he continued, and I heard in his voice something like awe, as if even his ancient civilization stood in wonder before what had happened on earth. What Christ did here, the pattern he established of divine love emptying itself into finite form, of resurrection following willing death, of love that transforms rather than dominates. This became the template that helped all of us understand what we'd been sensing in our own ways for millennia, that the Creator's fundamental nature is self-giving love rather than controlling power. I felt tears streaming down my face, because instead of my faith shrinking to accommodate alien revelations, it was expanding into something more beautiful than I'd ever imagined, a vision of Christ not as a tribal deity, claiming one species, but as the ultimate revelation of how God relates to all creation across every world where consciousness had evolved enough to ask the questions that only divine love could answer. Your Bible says that all things were created through Christ and for Christ, that in him all things hold together, and your theologians thought this was metaphor or mysticism. But we can see from outside your world that it's the most precise description of reality ever written in human language," he said, his glowing eyes reflecting what looked like starlight even though we were enclosed in wooden walls. "The same love that became flesh in Jesus is the love that seeded Mars and Venus, and the moons of Jupiter with life. The love that patiently guided evolution on every world toward consciousness capable of relationship. The love that refuses to abandon any world to its own darkness, but keeps finding ways to break through with light. We've been waiting for Earth to understand this," he said softly, and now his voice carried the weight of longing that must have accumulated across centuries of watching humanity struggle with violence and division while being so close to breakthrough, waiting for you to realize that the gospel Christ preached about God's kingdom coming to earth, as it is in heaven, wasn't just about individual salvation, but about collective transformation, about an entire world learning to organize itself around self-giving love instead of dominating fear, about humanity finally maturing enough to take its place in the cosmic family that has always existed, but which you've been too fractured to join. His hands tightened on my shoulders, as if he was trying to transfer understanding through touch. When words proved insufficient to carry the magnitude of what he was revealing, every act of compassion you perform is a vote for this future. Every time you choose mercy over vengeance, or generosity over hoarding, or inclusion over division, you're actively participating in the redemptive pattern that Christ planted in human consciousness. You're proving that Earth is developing the spiritual maturity that contact requires. I understood then that the quarantine he'd mentioned wasn't punishment but protection. Not God abandoning us, but God giving us time to let Christ's resurrection power work its way through our cultures and systems until we evolved from a species that would weaponize contact into a species that would celebrate reunion. Your destiny has always been to join us, he whispered as we heard the first sounds of approaching helicopters. And the Creator who loved you enough to become one of you is the same Creator who loves you enough to wait until you become who you were always meant to be. A people whose technology is finally matched by their theology, whose power to reach other worlds is balanced by wisdom to enter them as servants rather than conquerors, as family coming home rather than strangers seeking advantage. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the night air grew louder, their searchlights beginning to sweep across my property in methodical patterns that would find the barn within minutes, and my visitor stood with a grace that made his alien nature undeniable yet somehow more familiar than strange, as if I was seeing for the first time what humanity might look like after centuries of choosing love over fear. He reached into a fold of his garment and withdrew an object that seemed to contain its own light source, a crystalline structure no larger than my palm that pulsed with colors I had no names for, hues that existed somewhere between blue and something my eyes had never been trained to perceive. "This contains everything," he said, pressing it into my hands with a reverence that made me understand. I was holding something infinitely precious, images of our cities, records of our observations of Earth, testimonies from others like me who have walked among you across centuries, and most importantly, the mathematical and spiritual proofs that consciousness, life, and love are woven into the fabric of creation by the same hand that formed Christ in Mary's womb. The crystal felt warm against my skin, almost alive, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders like a mantle I had never asked for, but somehow had been preparing to wear my entire life. "You'll know when to share it," he continued, his luminous eyes meeting mine with a trust that seemed almost naive given that he barely knew me. Yet I understood that he had been observing humanity long enough to recognize those rare souls who would choose truth over safety, mission over comfort, the risk of being called crazy over the sin of remaining silent when revelation demands voice. The barn door rattled as wind from the approaching helicopters grew stronger, dust swirling in golden columns through the cracks where searchlights probed, and I wanted to beg him to stay, to give me more time to ask the thousand questions suddenly crowding my mind. But he stepped back with the sorrowful smile of someone who has said goodbye too many times, across too many years, to those he wished he could know better. "Remember that you were not chosen because you're perfect, but because you're willing," he said, and in those words I heard an echo of every biblical calling, every prophet who protested their inadequacy only to discover that God specializes in using cracked vessels specifically because the light shows through more clearly. The same Spirit that raised Christ from death lives in you and in every human who opens themselves to divine love. and that spirit will guide you in ways that my instructions never could. Will connect you with others who are waking up to these truths. Will orchestrate coincidences and confirmations that prove you haven't lost your mind, but found something more real than the consensus reality that keeps humanity locked in its cage of isolation. His form began to shimmer slightly as if he was already halfway between my world and whatever method of departure he had planned. And I felt panic rising because I knew that once he left I would doubt everything, would wonder if I had hallucinated or dreamed this encounter, would need some anchor to keep me tethered to the truth of this night. As if reading my thoughts, he placed one hand over my heart and said, "You will doubt. And that's good, because doubt that wrestles toward truth is more valuable than certainty that never questions. But in your deepest moments of fear, remember this feeling right now, this peace that surpasses understanding, this knowing that lives below the level of thoughts where divine truth writes itself directly onto human hearts." The barn door exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood and shouted commands, flashlight beams cutting through darkness like swords, and I instinctively moved to shield my visitor, but he was already moving toward the back wall with impossible speed, his hand touching the wooden planks which somehow opened like a curtain of water, allowing him to pass through solid matter as if physical laws were suggestions rather than constraints. I heard soldiers shouting at me to get down, felt hands roughly pulling me to the ground while others rushed toward where my visitor had vanished, and in the chaos I clutched the crystal to my chest, praying they wouldn't find it, wouldn't take the one piece of evidence that could validate my sanity and fulfill my mission. Through the barn's rear opening I caught a glimpse of my visitor standing in the field beyond, his form fully visible now in the searchlights, arms raised not in surrender but in what looked like benediction, and he turned back to me one final time, with an expression of such profound love that I understood how Christ must have looked at Jerusalem when he wept over the city that couldn't recognize its time of visitation. "Tell them," he called out, his voice somehow reaching me clearly despite the helicopter noise and shouting soldiers. "Tell them that the Creator's love is wider than they ever imagined, that their planet is not a prison but a chrysalis, that the family waiting beyond their quarantine loves them enough to let them choose freely whether to join the cosmic dance of mutual service or remain isolated in the gravity well of fear." Then light erupted from around him, not the harsh white of searchlights but a golden radiance that seemed to carry warmth and music and the scent of something like cinnamon and rain, and he rose into the night sky faster than any craft I'd ever seen, becoming a point of brilliance among the stars before vanishing completely as if he'd never been there at all, except for the crystal burning against my heart and the absolute certainty flooding my soul that nothing would ever be the same. They questioned me for hours in rooms without windows where time became meaningless, asking what I'd seen and who I'd hidden, and what he'd told me, and I answered with carefully selected truths that revealed nothing of importance while technically not lying, protecting the mission that had been entrusted to me by giving them just enough to satisfy their reports, while keeping the crystal and its contents secret in ways that surprised me with my own capacity for holy deception. When they finally released me with warnings about federal laws and national security, I walked out into a dawn that looked different than any sunrise I'd witnessed before. The sky no longer a ceiling but a doorway, each star no longer a distant sun, but a potential home to brothers and sisters I had never met, but who shared the same Creator and the same destiny of love, learning to recognize itself across vast distances. The crystal remains hidden in a place I'll never disclose, but its contents have begun spreading through channels I barely understand, finding their way to scientists who can verify its mathematical proofs, to theologians who recognize its spiritual truth, to ordinary people whose hearts were already prepared to receive good news that's bigger than they'd been told to expect, but exactly as big as the gospel always promised. I think of my visitor often, wondering if he made it home safely, if he's watching even now as humanity takes its stumbling steps toward the maturity that contact requires, and in my prayers I thank the Creator who loved us enough to send Christ to show us who God really is, and who loves us still enough to surround us with family we cannot yet see, but who wait with patience that only divine love can sustain. Wait for us to become the people we were always meant to be. Wait for the day when Earth's quarantine ends, not because we've achieved perfection, but because we've finally learned that love willing to wash feet and carry crosses and choose mercy over vengeance is the only force powerful enough to hold solar systems together, the only truth worth crossing the vast darkness between worlds to share. What would you do if you discovered we've never been alone? Subscribe to hear more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, creation, and our place in God's infinite design.